Most comedians, when they sit down for an interview, are performing. They have material. They have stories they've told before. They have a persona warm, self-deprecating, eager to please, calibrated to make the host comfortable, make the audience laugh, and make the segment end on time. Most comedians understand that a talk show appearance is essentially a commercial for themselves, and they behave accordingly. Norm Macdonald did not behave accordingly. Norm Macdonald sat down for interviews, the way a man might sit down to play a very long game of chess against someone who didn't know they were playing chess. He had no apparent interest in being liked. He had no apparent interest in making things easy. He seemed to find the interview format itself, the setup, the punchline, the host's delighted reaction vaguely suspicious, and he treated it as a thing to be dismantled rather than participated in. The result was some of the most uncomfortable, unpredictable, and ultimately transcendent television moments in the history of late-night comedy. This is Norm Macdonald's funniest interview moments nobody expected. Who was Norm Macdonald? Before we get into the moments, we need to understand the man. Norm Macdonald was born in Quebec City, Canada, in 1959. He grew up in small-town Ontario, the son of a schoolteacher father and a homemaker mother, and by his own account, had a fairly unremarkable childhood which he found perfectly fine because he was already spending most of his mental energy on comedy. He had an unusual sensibility from the beginning. He was not a performer in the conventional sense, not someone who craved attention or who lit up at the center of a room. He was, by all accounts, quiet and somewhat introverted in person, which makes his stage and screen presence all the more striking when you encounter it. Something happened when he was performing. He became something else. He worked the Canadian comedy circuit in the 1980s, built a reputation as one of the genuinely funniest people working, and eventually made it to the United States, where he broke through with a spot on Saturday Night Live in 1993. His SNL tenure, particularly his run as Weekend Update anchor from 1994 to 1997, is one of the most critically beloved in the show's history. His update was unusual because it didn't traffic in the knowing, winking irony that was the dominant comedy mode of the era. Norm played it straight. He delivered jokes as if they were simply true statements about the world. He didn't nudge you to let you know he was in on the joke. He trusted the joke to land, and if it didn't land, he seemed genuinely unbothered. He was fired from SNL in 1998, reportedly because an NBC executive, Don Ohlmeyer, didn't like him. The specific complaint was apparently that Norm kept making O.J. Simpson jokes during the period when Ohlmeyer was personally friendly with Simpson. Norm, when told about this, essentially continued making O.J. Simpson jokes. After SNL, he did a sitcom called Norm that ran for 4 seasons. He did stand-up specials, including the legendary Me Doing Stand-Up in 2011 and Hitler's Dog Gossip and Trickery in 2017. He hosted his own talk show format on YouTube called Norm Macdonald Live, and later Norm Macdonald has a show on Netflix. He died in September 2021 after a private 9-year battle with leukemia. He had told almost no one about the illness. His death came as a shock to most of the comedy world. In the years since his death, something interesting has happened. Norm Macdonald, who was always beloved by comedians and passionate fans, has been re-evaluated upward by a new generation, encountering his work through clips and compilations online. There is now a growing consensus that he was not just a very funny comedian, but possibly the most purely gifted comedian of his generation. A man who understood the structure of comedy more deeply than almost anyone, and who was willing to sacrifice the easy laugh for something stranger and more interesting. The interview moments are a perfect example of this. The Conan appearances. If there is one relationship that best illustrates what Norm Macdonald did in interviews, it's his relationship with Conan O'Brien.
Here with Norm Macdonald, and you know, I find out more and more about you every time you come on the program. You know, I always study up on a file and I learn more about you, and I was really surprised to learn, I didn't know this. I didn't know this, but you were a bartender.
Norm appeared on Late Night with Conan O'Brien dozens of times over the years, and the two men developed a comedic chemistry that remains almost without parallel in late-night history. But chemistry might be the wrong word. What they had was something stranger, a shared willingness to let things go somewhere uncomfortable and see what happened.
Well, you know, a man grows. But this is the point.
Yeah.
Chuck DeGetz, you know, he went to McGill University and he got 3 degrees, by golly.
Conan, as an interviewer, is actually very good. He's funny, he's quick, he's genuinely interested in his guests. But with Norm, Conan regularly found himself in situations where all of his interviewer's tools were useless. and the best thing he could do was watch. One of the most famous examples involves a story Norm tells about Bob Saget. A
TV blooper, Bob Saget.
Bob Saget.
TV blooper Saget.
Yeah, he directed it.
Yeah. Now, can he direct?
No, not at all.
Was it just a lot of people getting hit with a rake and stuff? Just bang!
Without going too deep into the specific details, you can find this clip easily, and should Norm tells what is ostensibly an absurdist joke in the form of a story, with a setup, a build-up, various diversions and complications, and then a punchline so anticlimactic and deliberately unsatisfying that the audience reaction shifts from laughter to confusion to a kind of awed silence and back to laughter. The joke is not really a joke in the traditional sense. It's a performance about joke structure. It's Norm demonstrating, in real time, on national television, that he understands comedy at a level where he can play with the form itself. Conan's reaction, and he's been asked about it many times, is that in the moment, he was genuinely unsure what had just happened. He knew it was funny. He could see the audience laughing, but he couldn't have explained why. And there was something about Norm's total commitment to the bit, his absolute refusal to acknowledge that anything unusual was happening, that made it impossible to process in real time. Another Conan appearance that people talk about involved Norm discussing his gambling problem. This should have been a softball segment. Comedian talks about a relatable personal flaw, gets some laughs, everyone moves on. Instead, Norm turned it into something that felt like an avant-garde short film about the nature of self-destruction and American masculinity, while also being very, very funny. He described gambling not with the reflexive shame that such topics usually summon in celebrity confessionals, but with something that sounded almost like admiration for the purity of it, for the honesty of a pursuit that offers no pretense of self-improvement, that is simply about the thing itself. Conan visibly didn't know how to respond to this, which is part of what makes it remarkable. He's one of the smartest people on television, and Norm regularly left him looking like he was hearing a language he almost but didn't quite understand. The Letterman relationship. Norm's relationship with David Letterman was different from his relationship with Conan, but equally remarkable. Letterman was, for decades, the gold standard of late-night interview hosts, not just a host, but a genuine comedian, someone who was doing his own subversive thing with the format. He was ironic, arch, self-aware, and didn't particularly like most celebrities. With Norm, Letterman seemed to encounter something that even he wasn't fully prepared for. The most discussed Letterman appearance, and this one really has to be seen to be believed, involves a story about a moth that comes into a doctor's office. The format is the shaggy dog story, which is a comedy tradition going back centuries. A long, digressive narrative that builds and builds with the apparent promise of a punchline, only to deliver something that seems completely disconnected from everything that came before. In lesser hands, the shaggy dog story is a party trick. In Norm's hands, it becomes something else entirely. He plays it completely straight. He takes his time, he adds details that seem significant but aren't. He pauses at the right moments. He looks at Letterman with complete sincerity. Letterman, who has seen everything and is difficult to genuinely surprise, watches this unfold with an expression that cycles through amusement, confusion, mounting unease, and then something close to genuine admiration. The punchline, when it arrives, is absurd. The joke doesn't make sense in the way that setups and punchlines are supposed to make sense. But by the time you get there, you've been on a journey. And the absurdity of the destination is perfectly calibrated to everything that came before. What Norm understood about Letterman and what made these appearances so good is that Letterman wanted to be surprised. He was bored by the conventional celebrity appearance. He wanted someone to do something he hadn't seen before, and Norm was consistently willing to provide that. In multiple appearances over the years, Norm also deployed what might be called the sincere compliment as a comedic weapon. He would tell Letterman with apparent complete honesty that he thought Letterman was a great man, that he admired him, that he found him genuinely inspiring. Letterman, being Letterman, found this deeply suspicious and was visibly unsettled by it, which Norm clearly enjoyed enormously. The Howard Stern dynamic. Howard Stern is one of the most skilled interviewers in the history of radio and podcasting. His ability to get people to say things they didn't plan to say, to find the emotional nerve and press it, to create an environment where confession feels natural and revelation feels inevitable. It's genuinely formidable. With most guests, this works. People come in prepared to be charming and leave having revealed things. With Norm, Stern's approach didn't really work, and what happened instead was something more interesting. Norm was genuinely impossible to trap. Not because he was guarded, he was remarkably open about many things, but because his relationship with sincerity and irony was so fluid that you could never quite tell when he was being one and when he was being the other. He would say something that sounded like a joke and mean it completely. He would say something that sounded completely sincere and be joking. And sometimes, it seemed like he was doing both simultaneously and wasn't sure himself which was which. When Stern pressed him on topics that would cause most people to become uncomfortable: career failures, personal struggles, relationships, Norm had a tendency to engage with the premise completely and then gently guide it somewhere unexpected. Not deflecting, exactly. More like redirection through total cooperation. He would agree with things. He would add details. He would build on the premise. And then somehow, through the accumulated weight of his additions and agreements, the original point would have been carried somewhere so far from where it started that the conversation was now about something completely different, and you couldn't identify exactly where the turn had been made. The moth joke and the philosophy of the anti-joke. We need to spend some real time on Norm Macdonald's approach to joke structure, because it's central to why the interview moments work the way they do. Most jokes follow a recognizable architecture. There is a setup information is provided that creates a context and an expectation. There is a punchline information that violates that expectation in a surprising but retrospectively logical way. The gap between what you expected and what was delivered is the joke. Norm understood this architecture completely. He studied it. He could reproduce it with perfect fidelity, and then deliberately, methodically, with full awareness of what he was doing, he would break it. The anti-joke, in its purest form, subverts the expectation of a joke by delivering something that is not funny or is funny only because of how unfunny it is, or is funny because of the performer's complete commitment to its unfunniness. Norm was the supreme master of the anti-joke. But here's the thing that people sometimes miss. Norm's anti-jokes weren't just exercises in subversion. They had their own structure, their own internal logic. The humor didn't come from randomness. It came from precision, from a calibrated calculation of exactly how far to go, how long to build, how flat to make the landing. The famous moth joke that he told Letterman is a perfect example. The punchline isn't actually random nonsense. It's a punchline to a joke that the setup was pretending it wasn't. When you understand what he's actually doing, which takes several viewings, the joke is even funnier than it was the first time. This is extremely rare in comedy. Most jokes get less funny as you understand them more. Norm's jokes often get funnier. The interview setting was perfect for this kind of comedy because it created a specific expectation. The host wants material. The audience wants to laugh. The segment needs to be a certain length. And Norm could manipulate all of those expectations simultaneously while appearing to simply be telling a story. The talk show guest as character. Something that rarely gets discussed about Norm Macdonald's interview appearances is the degree to which he was playing a character. Not a fully fictional character, not a persona built on false biography or elaborate concealment, but a heightened, selective version of himself. The Norm, who appeared on talk shows, was slightly more deadpan than the real Norm, slightly more willing to let silences extend, slightly more committed to the bit regardless of the audience's reaction. This is actually what most skilled comedians do. The talk show guest is a performance. But Norm's version was unusual because the character he was playing appeared to not know it was on a talk show. Most guests perform their ease. They perform their spontaneity. They tell stories that have been told before, as if they're occurring to them for the first time. The entire format depends on this particular fiction. Norm refused the fiction, or rather, he replaced it with a different fiction. He played someone who was genuinely just talking, genuinely just thinking out loud, genuinely unsure how this was going to end. Whether this was actually true, or was itself a performance, doesn't really matter. The effect was that every Norm Macdonald talk show appearance felt genuinely live in a way that very few other comedy performances do. You felt like something might go wrong. You felt like he might not land it. You felt, occasionally, genuinely worried for him, and then he would land it, or not land it in exactly the right way, and it would be somehow better than if he'd landed it conventionally. Specific moments worth noting. Let's go through some specific moments that deserve their own spotlight. The sports show moment. During a sports-focused segment on one of his talk show appearances, Norm was asked a question about a particular sports team or athlete, the kind of question designed to get a quick opinion and move on. Norm instead launched into an analysis that was at once completely sincere and completely absurd, breaking down the situation with what appeared to be genuine sports expertise, while simultaneously making it clear that the entire frame of the question was ridiculous. He said more about the nature of sports commentary in 90 seconds than most media criticism manages in an essay, The Story That Didn't End. On multiple occasions throughout his career, Norm began telling stories on talk shows that did not, by conventional standards, end. They didn't have punchlines in the conventional sense. They simply reached a point and stopped. Norm would then look at the host with an expression of complete satisfaction, as if the story's meaning was self-evident. And wait. The waiting was the bit. The host's confusion was the bit. The audience's uncertainty about whether to laugh was the bit. And eventually, because laughter is contagious, and because the audacity of what Norm was doing was itself funny, people would laugh sometimes harder than they would have laughed at a conventional punchline. The sincere compliment, deployed strategically, Norm had a way of telling hosts that he thought they were genuinely wonderful people, not in the rote, promotional way that celebrities do it, but with such apparent conviction and eye contact that it became slightly unsettling. The comedy came from the host's inability to process a compliment that seemed too sincere to be a joke, but too perfectly timed to be genuine. The non-answer answer. When asked direct questions about his life, his career, his opinions, Norm had a technique of giving an answer that was technically responsive to the question, but that addressed it at such a different level that it felt like a non-answer. The question was, "What do you think about X?" And the answer would be about the nature of thinking, or about a specific incident that seemed related, but whose connection to the original question never became clear. What the Norm interviews taught us about comedy. There is something that Norm Macdonald's interview appearances teach about the nature of comedy that is worth trying to articulate. Comedy, in its most conventional form, is about relief. The setup creates tension through expectation, and the punchline releases it. The laugh is the release. Norm was interested in something else. He was interested in comedy that didn't release tension that built it, and kept building it, and converted the tension itself into something pleasurable. He was interested in making you uncomfortable in a way that felt good, in making you unsure whether to laugh in a way that made you laugh harder when you eventually did. This is technically very difficult. Most comedians who attempt to subvert conventional joke structure end up just being confusing, or self-indulgent, or dull. What made Norm different was his absolute technical command of the form he was subverting. He couldn't have broken the rules the way he did without understanding them completely. You can hear it in the structure of even his most apparently formless material, the timing, the rhythm, the management of expectation. These are not the products of improvisation or accident. They are the products of someone who had thought about comedy at a deep structural level for a very long time. The interview setting gave him the perfect environment because it had its own rules, its own pacing, its own expectations, its own rhythms, and those rules were what he was playing against. Without the format, the subversion doesn't work. Without the host's expectation, the refusal to meet it isn't funny. When Norm Macdonald died in September 2021, the comedy world responded with a kind of grief that went beyond the conventional tribute. Comedians who are funny are celebrated. Comedians who are genuinely loved by other comedians are rarer. And comedians who inspire the kind of quiet, sustained reverence that Norm Macdonald inspired, the kind where people who knew him seem still, years later, slightly at a loss for words, those are rarer still. Part of what the internet has done, and occasionally the internet does something good, is make Norm's work accessible to a generation that didn't watch SNL in the 90s, or catch his talk show appearances in real time. The clips and compilations have introduced him to millions of new viewers, and the response has been consistent. This is different. This is something else. What is this? What it is mastery. Mastery of the form. Mastery of the moment. Mastery of the gap between what an audience expects and what it gets. Mastery of the seemingly simple Norm's material often looks effortless, and the effortlessness is itself the product of enormous effort and thought. His interview moments are so funny because they're so unexpected. And they're so unexpected because Norm was the only person who would have done them that way. Someone else with the same setup, the same host, the same audience, the same questions, they would have made a good talk show appearance. Norm made something that you're still thinking about 3 days later. Norm Macdonald sat down for hundreds of interviews across his career. He appeared on every major late-night show, on radio programs, on podcasts, on streaming platforms. Every single time, something happened that nobody expected. Sometimes it was a joke that shouldn't have worked, and somehow devastated the room. Sometimes it was a story that went somewhere inexplicable and was funnier for it. Sometimes it was a silence that went on just slightly too long and became the funniest thing in the segment. He never seemed to be trying to be funny. He never seemed to be trying to impress. He seemed to simply be doing what he was doing, and if you were on the wavelength, If you were paying close enough attention, if you were willing to follow him somewhere uncertain, you were rewarded with a kind of comedy that doesn't happen often. He was one of a kind. That phrase gets used too easily, but for Norm Macdonald it is simply accurate. Nobody does what he did, nobody has done what he did. And the interview moments, the unexpected ones, the ones that still make no sense and are still somehow the funniest thing you've ever seen, those are some of the best evidence that comedy, at its highest level, is an art form. Thanks for watching. If you love Norm as much as we do, hit subscribe and let us know your favorite Norm moment in the comments. There are too many to cover in one video, and there's a lot more where this came from. See you in the next one.